Please stand as you're able for the call to worship. And we'll read it together. Save me, O God. Do not let those who hope in you be put to shame because of me. Answer me, O Lord, for your steadfast love is good. According to your abundant mercy, turn to me. Do not hide your face from your servant, for I am in distress. Make haste to answer me. Believe God, creator of heaven and earth, giver of life and truth, life and breath. We believe that nothing can separate us from the grace, love, and mercy of God, who never hesitates to forgive the repentant heart. We believe in Jesus Christ, God in human vesture, who desires to be in this life with us, reaching out to love us into new life. We believe that he took upon himself our sin and rebellion, carried these to the cross, where he gave himself unto eternity for our sakes. This was his ultimate gift to us. We believe that his death was not the end, and that he will come again one day. We believe in the Holy Spirit, who speaks a fiery, passionate truth to all people, in every language. Our hearts are warmed, and we become the living proof of God's transforming presence. We believe that we are a church, the body of Christ, called to serve and to make a difference in God's world.
We're going to read the Lord's Prayer together. Our
Father in heaven, holy, holy, holy is your name. May your kingdom come, and your will be done on earth as it so surely is in heaven. Give us this day the food we need, and forgive us our sins as we forgive the sins of our neighbor. Guide us in the right paths. Lead us away from temptation, and keep us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews."
I am a maker and trader of fragrant oils, unguents, and balms. My family and I work to extract the gummy resin of the balsam trees that grow in my hometown of Jericho. It takes months for the buds of the trees to be cured into the aromatic oils, balms, ointments, and expensive perfumes we sell, but I promise you, the waiting is worth it. The fragrance is captivating and freshens any room in the house. The unguents and balms have incredible healing properties. They soothe and cool inflamed areas and will keep a wound from getting infected. Some have told me that our balm of Jericho actually soothes the pain of the wound as it heals. Rubbed into muscles tired and sore from long hours of work, the balm helps ease the discomfort. Will you listen to me? It's actually, I was trying to sell you the product. I have a story to tell. We have many clients in Jericho, but our products are also very popular in Jerusalem among Jews and Gentiles alike. There are many Jews who have no qualms about trading with the Samaritan, especially if the product is as good as ours. The Romans can't tell us apart. They think we all look alike. Neither do they care to understand the cause of the rift between Samaritans and Jews. It doesn't make any sense to me either that people who worship the same God, are descended from the same Eglon, will not work to settle the argument over where the temple should have been built after the exile. Enough of that. Back to the story. I travel over the mountain to Jerusalem all the time to deliver our balm to clients. Our eclectic clientele is always growing and includes soldiers, Roman dignitaries, rich housewives, Jewish and Gentile, courtesans, priests, and physicians. Rarely do they begrudge me the considerable cost of the product, because it can be used in so many ways. At certain times of the year when Samaritan, Jewish, and Gentile holidays coincide, it is difficult for us to keep up with the demand. My family and I make a good living, and I like my work. I particularly like hearing about all the different ways my clients find the unguents and oils useful. Not that my clients invite me in for tea to tell me about it. They report on its efficacy as they pay me and quickly close the door. My physician clients use it liberally on patients injured in all manners of accidents or battles. I know very well this balm works to heal. Having used it on a man I found half dead on the side of the road. I finished making my deliveries in the city and wanted to make it home by sunset when the Sabbath would begin. It is usually faster coming down the 11 miles than it is going up. The road is very rocky and rough, running alongside the deep chasm that is part of the wilderness that is the Judean desert. It was about 3 o'clock in the evening and the sun was lowering in the sky. I had only a few hours to get home before the Sabbath began. The Jericho road is not one to be traveling after dark, accompanied or alone. I came upon what looked like a dead body at the side of the road. The 2 people I had passed minutes earlier, heading up to Jerusalem, had offered no warning, but being Jewish holy men, they were not obliged. I crossed the road to take a closer look, and I heard him moan. He wasn't dead, but most certainly on the brink. Besides being beaten up, he looked half-starved as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. Naked and bruised from head to foot, with dried blood on his face, his torso, and in his hair. His nose was broken and his lips torn. His eyes were swollen shut. His own mother wouldn't have recognized him. He looked more like a corpse than a living, breathing man, but he was alive. I had to help him. My efforts might not save him, but I just couldn't leave him, as he most certainly would die. I brought some wine for him to drink and moistened cloths with it to cleanse his wound. Then I applied my healing balm to his wounds and wrapped them with clean cloths. I removed my own cloak and wrapped him in it. I offered him some more sips of wine as we rested together in the shade. I asked him who had done this to him, assuming he had been attacked by bandits. He could hardly speak through his swollen lips and parched throat, and was probably delirious. I can't be sure, but it sounded like he said, "The devil." Then he passed out. He needed care, rest, food, and water. He needed a physician. But first he needed to be rescued from this deadly place and be brought to safety. I lifted him up and placed him on my donkey. Together we made our way down the mountain. He was still out of his head most of the way, and I fought to keep him astride the animal. When we finally got to town, I brought the stranger to the Jericho Inn, where the innkeeper, Penduck Hughes, is a friend of mine. He was a bit skittish about having a half-dead Jewish stranger as a guest at his inn. Jews don't stay the night in a Samaritan city unless they have to. Penduck wanted no repercussions if the man died in his establishment. I paid Penduck the cost of a room and board for a few nights, plus a bit more, asking him send out for some clothes and sandals for the man's feet. I promised to return and pay the whole bill, no matter how many days the stranger needed to recuperate and get back on his feet. Together, we carried our patient to the nicest room in the inn. Once more, we cleaned his wounds and applied the healing balm to his cuts and bruises. I left the balm for him to use as he needed and opened a bottle of perfumed oil to give the room a pleasant fragrance. I patted the stranger's hand as I was leaving, promising to return. Suddenly, the stranger, quite in his right mind, reached out and clasped my hand in his. He held on tight, mustering all the strength he could. Forcing his eyes open, he looked at me, his expression full of questions and tenderness. A tear fell from his eye as he said, "I will never forget your kindness to me. What is your name?" "My name is Axel," I said, "Axel Placelow. And what is yours?" "My name is Jesus." That was all he said as his hands let go of mine, and he dropped back onto the pillow and fell sound asleep. May God's blessings be upon you, Jesus, and may you be healed and strong when we meet again. I returned the morning after Sabbath to see how he was getting on, but he was gone. Penduck reported that his guest ate and slept through the night on Friday and all day Saturday. But this morning, when he went to bring him breakfast, both the stranger and the balm were gone. I settled the bill with Penduck and went on my way. That was 3 years ago. I never saw the Jewish stranger again, but then I probably wouldn't recognize him with a swollen face. Perhaps he would remember me. Today I'm headed up to Jerusalem to make holiday deliveries. I am bringing 2 animals loaded with rock. With so many pilgrims in town for the Passover holiday, I am sure to find new buyers for my balm of Jericho.
One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you have come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."
42. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, Certainly this man was innocent. And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.
I have not always had to do this work to survive and feed my children. I was married at 16 to a man chosen for me by my parents. He was a good man, and we were a good match. He owned a vineyard just outside the city of Emmaus. He took meticulous care of the vines, and those who worked for him thought him a fair boss. I worked alongside him, learning how to care for the vines, pruning them, determining when they were ready for the harvest. We had 2 sons. His parents were no longer alive. My parents lived in the city proper and cared little about farming. When I was just 26, my husband fell ill and died. My sons were still very young, too young to work in the vineyard. My husband had no siblings, no younger brothers to take on the duty of husband. The workers were not eager to accept me as the new manager of the vineyard. The death expenses took all of our savings, so there was no money left to hire an experienced manager. I had to figure out a way to save our home, our vineyard, my husband's legacy. I went into the city to ask my parents for a loan, but they confessed they had no confidence in my ability to carry on in my husband's stead. It was too risky, and if I failed, it would cost them dearly. My father was brutishly insensitive, telling me to find an old man to marry and get on with my life. I was still mourning my husband and left their house in a rage. Feeling dejected, defeated, and helpless, I wandered the streets of the city and soon found myself in an area totally unfamiliar to me. As it grew dark, I became frightened, realizing just how lost I was. I began to run, and as I rounded a corner, crashed into a woman, nearly knocking her down. She grabbed me by my shawl, I thought, to catch herself, but she glared into my face and raised her arm to slap me. But she stopped quite suddenly, reconsidering, and said, "Who are you then? And what are you doing walking the streets of the district?" "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean by the district," I said. "I am so sorry I bumped into you, but I am quite lost. I was just trying to find my way home." "Dearie, you found your way into the district, and it's much too late for you to be walking these streets alone. Tell you what, you look like a nice enough girl. You can stay the night at my place. I got plenty of room. You can go home in the morning. Let's get you something to drink and warm you up. Maybe I'd better go back to my parents' house." "You could do that," she said. "But first, let's have a sip of wine to calm your nerves." That was the night I made friends with Cleo, a woman from the district, that is, a woman of the streets, who that very night showed me how to survive as a woman, not a helpless widow. No doubt about it, the work was demeaning, but it was what I chose to do to feed my family and keep a small portion of the vineyard productive. I lived as 2 different women, the vineyard owner and the woman of the night. By day a widow, by night a harlot. I lived that life for 7 years with no one being the wiser. I was known to my clients as Myra, famed for the lovely scented perfumes and oils I used in my work. They were mixed especially for me by Axel, the Samaritan. He sold balms and ointments that smelled like heaven. I bathed in them, and the aroma served as my magnet, summoning all those willing to pay for my particular ministrations. One evening, I was walking to my corner of the district when a man stopped short and looked at me, somewhat confused. He smiled at me broadly, almost as if I was a long-lost friend. I was a bit taken back. He was not, I surmised, a potential customer. He didn't leer at me or coo or make suggestive remarks. He just asked the name of the perfume I was wearing. I answered that it was a special preparation called the Balm of Jericho. He brightened even more and said, I would recognize that fragrance anywhere. The man who makes that balm saved my life. At that statement, I was so intrigued, I invited him in to tell me his story. He introduced himself as Jesus of Nazareth. We walked into the early hours of the morning. Every story he told me about all the people he had met in his travels lifted my spirits. He had actually seen the blind regain their sight, the insane return to their right mind, and the dead brought back to life. He had even known lepers who were cured. Everything about this man was extraordinary, except his appearance. His clothes, his face were ordinary, but his eyes had an intensity like any others. In his presence, something inside me was changing. My spirit felt refreshed, as if strengthened. My imagination was filled with new ideas, new thoughts, new possibilities. When it was time for me to head home to the vineyard, his words just lingered in my thoughts. They felt like a fire burning within me. I shouted to the heavens as I walked, I will be the master of my own vineyard. I will be the master of my life. I will no longer be a woman of the district. It was an extraordinary moment. It was an extraordinary decision. Today, Myra would leave the district behind forever. It was just one more thing I had to do. That evening, I returned to the city and searched the man who saved my life, bringing with me the most expensive jar of the balm I owned. It wasn't difficult to find him. After I dusted up in the local synagogue, his name was known all over town. Tonight he was dining with Simon the Pharisee. Myra knew Simon. I knew his house. I found it, walked in, and walked over to Jesus. Simon was apoplectic, but he said nothing. When I saw my new friend, Jesus, something inside me broke wide open. I fell to his feet, sobbing. The tears of what? Of grief, of sorrow, of relief, of joy fell on his feet. I rubbed the salty drops into his feet with my hair, as if cleansing them with every bit of sadness and sorrow that flowed from my heart. I then broke open the jar of expensive balm of Jericho and poured it over his feet. As I did so, Jesus spoke to the other guests. I didn't hear what he was saying until he took my head in his hands and looked into my eyes. In a strangely commanding voice, he said, "Your sins are forgiven." He stared into each other's eyes for a moment. Then I dried my tears and I stood up. I stood tall, looked at each guest, walked out into my future. As I heard Jesus' final farewell, "Your faith has saved you. Go in peace."
Luke describes individuals casting lots after Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." Traditionally, people have imagined soldiers at the foot of the cross shooting dice, as if gambling for Jesus' garments, but casting lots was a method used to foretell the future. In Old Testament stories, priests threw painted dice or knuckle bones onto the ground to determine which goat was to be sacrificed to the Lord, and which goat would serve as the scapegoat, carrying upon its back all of the sins of the children of Israel. The scapegoat was sent off into the wilderness alone. Today we are aware that as the soldiers cast lots, Jesus has taken on both roles.
Now there was a good and righteous man named Joseph, who, though a member of the council, had not agreed to their plan and action. He came from the Jewish town of Arimathea, and he was waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, laid it in a rock-hewn tomb where no one had ever been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The woman who had come with him from Galilee followed, and they saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointments. On the Sabbath, they rested according to the commandment.
I'm one of the women disciples of Jesus. It's not a fact I share with many people, as my husband is a steward in the court of Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee. As the ruler of the northern region, Antipas built a city complete with a stadium and a splendid palace on the Sea of Galilee. He named the city Tiberias in honor of the Roman emperor who appointed him. My husband, Chuza, and I reside in Herod's palace, which is Greek in style and very ornate, with figures carved on the outer walls. My curiosity about Jesus began soon after Herod, in one of his more petulant moods, executed John the Baptist. Soon afterwards, there were rumors circulating that Jesus of Nazareth was John the Baptist come back from the dead. My days living in the palace were not heavy with chores. I often went on long walks to get away from the toxic environment of the palace with its daily dramas and feuding among the relations. One day, as I walked along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, I saw a man speaking to a crowd of people. He was actually standing in a boat a short distance from the shore. He talked about God in a manner I had never heard before, and I was captivated by his simple, uncomplicated invitation to all of those who had ears to hear. This was the man from Nazareth. I checked myself to see if I wasn't being some kind of a spy for Herod. No, that would never be the case. I kept quiet about what I did on my outings. Herod's concern over Jesus' growing popularity turned into an obsession. People said he was Elijah, others a prophet, and some whispered that he was the Messiah. Herod sent out spies and listeners, wanting to know everything Jesus was doing and saying. Jesus had close followers, men and women, and there were some fishermen who had left their businesses, their families, hearth and home, to follow him. Although I sought out every opportunity to hear him speak, I kept my distance and a low profile, but I saw how he transformed people's lives. He seemed willing to be in anyone's company, rich or poor, saint or sinner, clean or unclean. I wanted for nothing myself, and I lived comfortably, but my heart and my mind were inextricably drawn to Jesus and his life-changing work. I wanted to serve him, not Herod. How, I wondered, could I become a part of this ministry? If I was gone for more than a few days, my poor husband would become concerned, and the last thing he needed was more worry. I made a plan. I told him that I was planning a trip to visit my parents in Jerusalem for some weeks. He was so busy tending to Herod's constant demands that he left the arrangements for my journey to me, assuming that I would be safely escorted to my destination. It may have been ill-advised and impulsive, but I left the palace unescorted and joined the entourage following Jesus. Crowds followed him to open fields and deserted places and camped out, refusing to leave or go home. Indeed, he was a man of miraculous deeds, and on one occasion managed to turn 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish into a meal that satisfied thousands. The disciples collected the baskets of leftovers and took it with them, since they were never sure where their next meal would come from. One evening, when we stopped for the night, I mustered my courage to approach those who were in Jesus' inner circle. As I came close, I heard a few of the disciples grumbling because they had run out of food and they were hungry. I had purchased food along the way and had bread, fruit, and dried fish to share. It could be for all of us. Somewhat clumsily, I spoke up, offering what I had, and was greeted by Jesus' eager smile. He immediately invited me to join the group, and everyone was so grateful. The truth was, I had means, and I was eager, myself, to support Jesus' work. The 2 women disciples, Mary and Susanna, embraced me as a sister. They had been healed by Jesus and shared their very personal, moving stories with me. Susanna was widowed, left destitute by her husband's family, and Mary had been brutalized by a drunken father. They were, in spite of their injuries, strong women, devoted and smart. I was honored to be with them. From that evening on, my days were inspiring and full of purpose. Now, one of Jesus' disciples, my heretofore unremarkable life had promise. Mary, Susanna, and I ministered to Jesus and the rest. We were joined by Jesus' own mother, the mother of James and John, and the sisters Mary and Martha, and more. Those of us with money and means supported the rest. I returned to put in an appearance at the palace from time to time, but my poor husband was so busy trying to manage Herod's paranoia and mania for building things that he seemed relieved to think of me going off to enjoy myself elsewhere. Looking back, the signs that a change was coming were clear. Rumors that Herod wanted to rid Galilee of Jesus abounded. Jesus decided to leave Galilee and go to Jerusalem with a plan to be in the city for the Passover holiday. He must have known that Herod journeyed to Jerusalem for the Passover as well. Everything that happened in Jerusalem happened so quickly and unpredictably, it's more like a blur than a reality. From the moment we arrived, Jesus seemed to do all he could to stir up the resentments against him. He was not one to keep a low profile. The day Peter, James, and John returned from the temple, telling how Jesus, in a fury, had enraged the priests by overturning the tables of the money changers, everything was thrown off kilter suddenly. The very air we breathed seemed weighed down with gloom. We were all very nervous, making the preparations for the Passover feast, sensing that something was terribly wrong. And we were right. Jesus was arrested that very night, dragged off by thugs. Peter told us how he watched Jesus being tried for blasphemy before 23 judges of the Sanhedrin. The verdict was guilty. Because Jerusalem was under Roman jurisdiction, the judges were obliged then to bring Jesus before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate to be sentenced. We had no idea what was going on until word came to us that Jesus was being marched out of the city to be watched as the guilty were punished on the hill called the Skull. We were helpless to save the life of our Lord, our leader, our master, who had blessed us so and instilled in us a passion for living. And when it was all over, Mary, Susanna, and I went with Joseph from Arimathea, who had claimed Jesus' body. We went with him to a tomb that was newly hewn out of rock. Joseph wrapped Jesus' body in a fresh linen shroud and laid him in the tomb to keep him safe until the 24 hours of the Sabbath had passed. It fell to my sisters and me to make ready the spices and oils we would use to anoint his body 2 days hence. Not having anticipated the dreadful task, we were unprepared. We held on tight to each other as we passed out of the tomb, leaving the dear one behind, and began walking back to the upper room. We were approached by a stranger and started to move off in the other direction when he called after us with a tremor in his voice, Are you the women who followed the man called Jesus who was crucified? We stopped, not knowing if he meant to accuse us or comfort us. We spent a little time together 3 years ago, he said. I am most grieved to hear of his death. Please let me give you something. I know you must prepare his body for burial. His eyes filled with tears as he said, I realize you may be hesitant to take a gift from a Samaritan, but it would be a kindness to me, and I believe this balm will help you in your task. He placed in each of our hands a jar of his ointment, and I recognized the sweet, soothing fragrance immediately. We all did. Jesus carried a jar of this same balm with him always. He used it to soothe his road-weary feet. I clutched the jar to my heart and thanked Jesus' Samaritan friend as he went on his way. As we walked on, surrounded by the fragrance of the balm, it felt as though Jesus walked with us.
Oh, Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you